us looking at this account here with the woman here in Samaria. Now, we could really look at almost the entire chapter because it's a significant amount of conversation and theology. Let me say this about the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as I mentioned Sunday, are synoptic, so one eye. So you're getting 3 accounts of basically the same stories. That's why they're synoptic Gospels. And John's very different. So John doesn't even tell the stories he does in what you could consider history in the same sense as the other 3. So he's giving us the words of Jesus. He's giving us the deeds of Jesus. He's doing all of that. So that's all real and historical. But he weaves the stories together around certain events because he's emphasizing something. So we may jump into some of that here in chapter 4 as we start to unpack it for a little bit. But just to kind of throw that out there, that when you're reading the Gospel of John and he says something that you notice is different than what the synoptics say, that's not a contradiction. It's John's writing so much later than the other 3, and everybody in the church history knew it. So they knew when he's doing that, he's drawing your attention to something else. So just to kind of keep that in mind. So we're going to start in chapter 4, verse 1. And we will take this down through verse 30. That's the scope of what we can look at, but really it's going to be through 26. Really, is most of his discussion with her, and so we'll start there. So if anybody's got that and wants to read, say the first 15 verses, go for it.
Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and went away again into Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph, and Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle?" Jesus answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life."
The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he. All right. So let's start with observations. Now remember, we're wanting to look at the text here. At the text to see what observations. We'll just do that first. Observations. What do you notice in the passage that jumps out to you? And for those of you that have never done this, you've never looked at the Bible and tried to figure out what it means. I'm gonna teach you something that'll help you. Who, what, where, when. You want to take that guess the next one? There you go. It sounds elementary, and it is, but I'm telling you, that right there will start pulling out all kinds of stuff in the text that will... John 4, Lucille.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, okay.
You wrote it up there.
Oh, yeah, I did. You don't have to raise your hand. So
interesting that she's alone at the time that he. So that's she has the advantage. He has given her the advantage of privacy.
That's good. What else?
Because it didn't have to be that way.
I remember people saying that when they talk about this passage, how she is there alone, how normally people draw the water early in the morning and she's doing it late to avoid everybody.
You're bringing up a good point, and I was waiting for someone to bring it up. That is an inference. I've heard lots of teaching and sermons on that too because of this. When John says this is the 6th hour, and so they come along and they say, well, that's noon. I'm not sure that's a literal figure, and we'll talk about that in a second. So this is inference because this is observation, like this is clearly stated. Well, what does that possibly mean? So we can infer on that, but let's stick here first. But we will get to that, yeah. What else?
She's very direct. She doesn't fool around saying, hey, I'm a Samaritan, you're a Jew. What are you asking me for? Do you know what I'm saying? She's very direct speech.
Yeah.
And particularly for a woman to a man at that time, I would think that would be very direct.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, I ain't giving you a drink, but I don't want to go there. That's a difference.
Mm-hmm. Well, because we didn't read it, but if you keep going in the passage, it says the disciples don't say to him.
Yeah.
So they know. Yeah, they know. She knows too. Like, what are you talking to me? Feminist theory says that Jesus is flirting with her. That's why I don't like feminism. It's one of the reasons. But what else? Hermeneutics, Andy. It's in seminary. You'll get to read that book, buddy.
Looking forward to it.
No, you're not. Not that one. Hey, y'all, what's up? Need a Bible?
That he goes to a lot of trouble in this to say where that well is.
A lot of speech about the well.
Plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Near there.
Why bring up Jacob? This is going to be inference, matter of deduction. We're going to
the ancestor of both the Samaritans and the.
Mm-hmm.
So what is she, when she brings him up, what is she invoking? We're legitimate.
Yeah. Because they're considered illegitimate. Like, that's why the Jews don't.
Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. John says it right in there. I like how the King James says that he must needs go. The English says he had to. The King James says must needs, because in the Greek it's a significant emphasis, because the road doesn't go through Samaria. The road the Jews took specifically goes around it.
Right.
So he goes into Samaria on purpose.
Yeah.
So the must needs is clearly just for this right here, just to go see her.
Yeah.
And to lay the ground for what happens in Acts chapter 8 too, by the way. What else? Other observations? John 4.
I guess where she says you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep, maybe kind of speaks a parallel to her faith or lack of faith.
Explain to me.
She doesn't see the tools that he has. I don't know. Just something that's stuck.
No, you're right. How do we phrase that? His speech,
His speech is possible, hers is impossible.
Let's stay here. So the observation about him not having something to get a drink with is true. And so when you go from here to here is when you get into what... So when he says to her, give me a drink, and she says, the well's deep, you don't have anything. Well, okay, there's clearly significance in that conversation, but not yet. We don't want to get there yet.
Are you talking about like he's kind of talking about spiritual aspects and she's talking more
Not yet.
worldly? Okay.
Not yet.
But you know, she does bring up Jacob again, doesn't she? You greater than our father Jacob.
What's Jacob's name?
Israel.
What's it mean?
But is Jacob God? Is that, I didn't know that.
Jacob, no, Israel.
Israel does. Jacob means supplanter,
Planter, yeah.
deceiver. Israel is the prince of God because he wrestles with the angel of the Lord at Penuel. I've seen the face of the Lord and I'm alive. So when she says, are you greater than our father Jacob? What she's saying is, have you seen the face of God? Have you wrestled with God? Have you... I am he will say later on. There's so much messianic conversation here, but one of the reasons I keep saying stick with the observations is because remember the focus of the class is what charism, what gift of the Spirit is an operation that opens the door for evangelism.
Word of knowledge.
Yeah, he's having a word of knowledge where he's seen, he knows that she's had more husbands, not married and has had several husbands. And he goes right to it. That's the conversation he's invoking almost pretty quick, you know, call your husband.
Yes. What is her response?
I have no idea.
Sir, I perceive that you are... We're going to come back around to discuss the specifics of the text for a second. But I want to say this, that often when we seek to, I'll just use the word engage. We go to engage people, and we see that, they've got something visibly wrong with them. And if you're new in healing ministry, you're going to think, well, let me pray for that thing I see that's visibly the issue. And that may not be the thing the Lord wants to release grace for in that moment. Because as you pointed out, no one's there. It's private. Jesus could talk to her about anything. But he doesn't do that. And he doesn't get drawn into theological discussion with her either. So what it means is that one of the things it means is that particular release of grace, that particular charism, is this specifically what she needs to hear that then unlocks in her the faith to receive everything else he's got to say that the text doesn't talk about. Because when she goes back to the village, come meet the man who's told me everything I've ever done. Well, where's that in the actual verses of Scripture? But whatever that word did in her opened up that capacity for her to go out and say, you got to see this, you got to see this, you got to see this. And so then they go out and they hear Jesus, and then they say to her, we don't believe because of your testimony anymore. We believe because we have observed ourselves. Okay? If you are, before I jump into that, any other observations and then that you've got, and we can jump into possible inferences, but I'd like you to kind of keep it here, but if it's something that's screaming at you.
I think maybe we kind of said this, but he broke a lot of social barriers by even speaking to her and having a conversation with her.
Mm-hmm. What else?
prophet, and he prophesies what's going to happen in the future about, who will worship the Father. And then just explains something about God. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth.
I want to point that out right there, because in spirit and truth. What do you notice about that phrase? Let me. I gotta get a new one. I said that Sunday, didn't I? In lowercase s.
It does say mine shows lowercase.
And this is more or less because of the way you see it get quoted on T-shirts nowadays. Usually you'll see this, in spirit and in truth. It's really cool. Problem is, that's not what he said.
Right.
And I'm not talking about this, I'm talking about this.
Right.
I have the NIV and it's capital spirit.
It's the translators. The translators are showing what they think he's talking about.
I don't follow differentiation. I mean, I see it, what you say. I observe it. I don't understand the inference you're making.
Yeah. So because you don't have this preposition in front of both of these, they're one thing.
Right.
Okay.
Because people will talk about, well, my worship is spiritual and yours is truth. Or mine's truth and yours is spirit. That's not what he's saying. Because wherever the spirit goes, truth is. Wherever truth goes, the spirit is. And who was it? Was it you, Liz? Sunday morning? No, it was Karen who mentioned, who asked a question about churches that divide between word and spirit, right? Isn't that how she asked it? And this is what because people, that's biblically not true. There's no way to live into the truth of God and not have the Spirit of the Lord. And there's no way to receive the Spirit of the Lord and not be walking in the truth of God. If you're doing one of those two without the other, then you're doing it wrong. So,
The interesting thing is, as soon as she recognizes him as a prophet, her next statement is about where her ancestors worshipped.
because it's the hot button issue of the day. So, okay,
Well, they had prophets too, right?
Israel?
No, Samaritans.
Yes, if I understand what you're asking. Like the northern tribes.
Well, whoever became the Samaritans, I'm still confused about that.
Okay, let's talk about
this. Galilee,
okay.
further north.
Here we go.
It's not amazing.
Here's the delta, then the Nile and Alexandria. Okay, here's Jerusalem. Here's the sea. Here's the sea. And Jerusalem's like right here. And Samaria's up here, give or take. All right? You got the Philistine cities down here, but and up here is Damascus. All right? So this is Israel. Okay? 12 tribes. Most of them are up here, and you got Judah and Benjamin down here. All right? Levites, they don't have one. Saul, how long are the judges in power? Something like 400 years, according to some scholars. That's a long time that the judges rule and there's no king. That's where I think most of American Christianity is. But you get this because it's legit. Like they're really the tribes of Israel. There really is a law. There really are priests. There really are prophets and judges. But man, they ain't getting along with each other. So, but Saul and then David and then Solomon unites the kingdom, right? So Solomon, if you read the Kings, Solomon, the way the Bible describes the days of Solomon is as the fulfillment of the covenant God gave to Moses. It's incredible. And so then Solomon, he sins, right? Jeroboam, the prophets, all that. So it gets cut in half. Now, 2 tribes here, 10 tribes there. Where is the temple? Where's Dan, the town? Where's Beersheba? When the Bible says from Dan to Beersheba, it's saying the whole of Israel. Okay? If you were going to go worship God according to God's commandments, and you were one of these tribes, what did you have to do? You had to cross the boundary. But what did Jeroboam? He immediately begins doing this. What does he do to keep the people from going back to David's line? He creates two calves, one in the north and one in the south. Well, you get what I mean. North and south. And so he creates there the golden calves that Israel goes to worship, the sins of Jeroboam. And there he builds altars and temples and creates a priesthood that functions there in Israel, the northern tribes. It's not what God gave to Moses. We have no record, I won't say no record. When we read the Old Testament, who are the two mightiest prophets in the days of the kings? Where do they live? Why? Because they're not obeying. And so God, through many of the prophets and other minor prophets in the Old Testament, is constantly talking about Assyria coming to destroy these. He's going to take them away. So they get exiled. They get taken away. And eventually they come back and they resettle. Some of them do. We really don't know a whole lot about it, other than there are Jews that show up here and they intermarry with the pagan Gentiles that are living there already. That's the Samaritans. They're living in Samaria, keeping some of the law of Moses and some of the commandments and circumcision. They're keeping some things, but they're not keeping the whole of the law, and they're not considered really fully part of Israel by Judah.
But the Galileans, where do they fit into it? After the exile, where do they
The Galileans are up in the north too. See, Peter's accent's what gives him away. That's how they know he's not from Judah. If you ever get a chance, it's a claymation. It's for kids, but it's one of the best renditions of the Bible I've ever seen. It came out 20 years ago. But it's a claymation of the life of Jesus. And they're all British accents, except for Peter. He sounds Irish. And I thought, well, that's yeah. I mean, that's how it was, equivalent. So when he goes through Samaria, the road, as I mentioned, went around it up to where he was going, because Galilee's up here. But it says he does this. He goes through it to get to Galilee. He doesn't go around it. So she brings up Samaria and Jacob to say, look, we've got a legitimate claim on God too. It's not just the Jews in Jerusalem.
So what is the significance of all the prophets coming from the north?
God calling them to repent. You think about Ahab and the whole thing at Carmel when Elijah prays down fire, and the people cry out, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." How many years do they actually worship Him before they go back into their full-blown idolatry? It's not long. It's not long. In the northern tribes, you see Israel in the wilderness again, miracle after miracle, and then refusal to listen after refusal to listen. He's going to Samaria for a couple of reasons. She's the reason, but then she's a representation of a larger thing that's going on. Because when he points out that she's had no husband, that the man she's living with isn't her husband, she's had 5. What is he saying about her? You really are Samaritan. Because you Samaritans had been in constant idolatry and constant rebellion and constant disbelief. But I'm come to get you. I'm coming to get you. That's what he's saying. That's inference. And that's inference drawn from the Old Testament to what he's doing there, and then syncing John 4 with John 2 and John 19. Interpreting, yeah.
I think for the first time I see this conversation as perhaps not as gentle as I might have perceived it in the past. You know what I mean? Just
Yeah.
Why are you asking me for water? You don't have anything to draw water with, and you Jews.
That's right. That's what she's doing.
She's a little aggressive.
And what does he say? He responds this. He says, "You don't know who you worship. Salvation is of the Jews." He doesn't say, let's have a PC conversation about how you feel. He doesn't do that at all. Which is significant because here's another thing I want to point out. And I'm going to jump into a bit more teaching on the text as this relates to living in the Spirit and being empowered by the Spirit as we go about our daily business. We will read that passage and zero in on that word of knowledge and make that the whole thing. That word of knowledge is a means towards a much bigger end. So, I'm going to sketch this out pretty quick, and if you're writing notes, feel free, but don't feel like you got to just observe. Okay? So in John 2, where is Jesus? He's at a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Right? What's there? Water jars. How many stone water jars? 6. What's he do? He turns them into wine. What does he call Mary there? Woman. He says, my what isn't yet come? My hour. It's not yet. Like, why are you bothering me? It's kind of how it comes off. He doesn't mean it disrespectfully. Now, use a different color so you can see the contrast here. And there's more parallels we can get into, but just for the sake of this, okay? And then in John 4, where is he? Samaria and Sychar town, right? Who's he talking to? He calls her woman, not married. This is discontinuity. This is continuity. Or, I'm sorry. Okay? What does he ask for? What time is it? You seeing this? Okay? And now, he says, he says, my hour's not yet come. What's he say here? Hour is coming. Talks about the Spirit, talks about truth. We could we can unpack a lot more of this. Okay, and then John 19 he's on the cross. He's on the cross. Oh, this is the other thing I forgot. At the end of this story, it talks about Passover. Okay, he's on the cross. What's he say when he's on? There's several things he says. What does he say to John? Your mother. What does he say to? What does he call his mother? What comes out of his side? What time is it? The hour has come. So you can see the whole gospel building. Okay? This is why I'm saying you got to be careful with John when he uses numbers, because what time is this? It's noon. What time do Matthew, Mark, and Luke say he got nailed to the cross? 9 a.m. Not noon. So John he's telling the story, but he's inserting stuff into it that he wants you to see. Like he's saying, he's giving you a theological teaching through the form of a story. It's rabbinic. They did it all the time. All the time. We moderns are the ones who have issues with it, not them. Okay? So, all this to say, we can go to this passage in John 4 and talk about the word of knowledge and the prophecy. But look at that, how it fits in the continuity and the whole trajectory of what's happening. And we would be in error to isolate a singular manifestation of grace and say, this is the core. This is. And all these things go to the cross. And so when you start thinking about your life in the Spirit is always taking us to the death and resurrection. He's always doing it. No matter what manifestations or charisms or releases of power, as much as we want them. You understand what I mean? But you put that in the context, and what that starts doing is that, one, it frees you from a misguided burden that says, I must operate in this gift, or I must operate in that gift. The gift that you should operate in is the one that needs to be. Questions? I know that's a lot.
Go back to what you were talking about, the rabbinic tradition.
Yeah.
And the difference between noon and 9 o'clock, and John, telling a story.
Yeah, so in John, I'll give you a different example. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when does Jesus cleanse the temple? It's either Tuesday or Wednesday of Holy Week. He does it like several days before his crucifixion, and the gospel writers present his cleansing of the temple as the straw that breaks the camel's back, that sends Judas and them colluding to go get him betrayed. In John's gospel, it's like the first thing he does. And so Bible scholars who operate under a modernistic reading say, well, he must have cleansed it twice. I don't think you can get away with cleansing the temple twice. So when you start looking at more and more details in John's gospel, and like the numbers are important because he tells us 4th day, 5th day, 7th hour. Like he's giving these numbers in the midst of a story that could be used to say, yeah, well, it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon when John the Baptist and the others saw him. It could be. Could be. But does the number reflect something else that he's pulling from the Old Testament that's in continuity with the way rabbis would teach? Yeah. And then typically when you can see those points, like stuff splashes off of the page. And one of the things to do if you think that you're seeing that is the first place you want to go see if that's accurate is check out the fathers, because they were clued into all that. So they make the resurrection appearances in John. He appears, Easter's the first day of the week, and then it's 8 days later. So the fathers of the church have long said, well, 8 days, that's the following Sunday, because the whole of the new covenant is an 8th day. It's a new day of creation because we live in new creation. So it's a way of reading and understanding the numbers, because otherwise, if you start looking at commentators, Augustine does it as one of the church, as early fathers, but everybody for the past 300 years is trying to figure out how it is John can say he's crucified at noon. So just the sheer volume of commentators to talk about corruptions in the Greek manuscripts. And I'm thinking, it's a whole lot easier if you think he's writing as a Jewish rabbi. And it's a bit more congruent with the history of the time.
It's also congruent with the way he wrote the rest of the gospel.
Right.
His gospel is so different.
Right. So like in Matthew, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. You know what that verse is called? The Johannine thunderbolt. Because John is filled with those awesome statements. The other gospels are not. He doesn't talk like that there. But you've got him here with this woman at the well saying flat out, I'm the Messiah. And everywhere else in the synoptics, shh, don't tell anybody.
Well, one of the Bible studies I read is that John wrote, most people think he wrote it last.
Yeah.
But also that he was really trying to talk about who Jesus was.
Yeah.
Not just what he did.
Yeah.
He tried to show his divinity, his humanity.
Right. So what
through the stories he chose to pick and how many, miracles he didn't talk about, and
exactly. Luke says to Theophilus, I set about to give you an orderly account. So I'm long of the opinion, and so are a lot of people smarter than me, that if you want a chronology of what happened, read Luke. Because he's a doctor. He's trying to give you the equivalent of a historian's account of that day. Luke's doing that. Matthew, straight up a rabbi. Matthew's gospel is arranged like the Pentateuch, like the first 5 books of Moses. His gospel breaks down into major, lengthy discourses around certain events. Moses goes up on Sinai, gets the law, gives it to the people. Jesus goes to the mountainside and gives them the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, it's just parallel after parallel after parallel. John, 7 major signs, and then 7 discourses about the signs and what they mean, and all of them point to other bigger theological issues. Yeah.
The 6 is that, are we supposed to be, if you were Jewish, would you take those as like a clue because the number 6 has some symbolism or significance? And that's why there's 6 jars, 6 hours, and then he throws in a 6th hour when it really wasn't? Yeah?
I think so. It's difficult because we're looking back and we're saying, okay, well, if they thought it this way, then this is probably what they meant. And I say, as long as we stick with probably, I think we're okay.
Right.
But the moment we turn it into
Right.
only because you'll see that, especially when people get into like numerology, the numbers in the Bible. They're like, well, this Bible is this all the time. Yeah, hold on. Like lions, is it the devil or is it the lion of the tribe of Judah? Because Scripture uses a lion to speak about both.
Right.
So we just have to be, but I think so, yeah. Because 6 water jars turns into what? The best wine. 6th hour, giving away to the 7th, which is the rest of God and creation and Sabbath and all that stuff. I even wonder if Christ's side isn't the well the water comes out of. But there's a whole, like there's so much theological poetry, I guess you could phrase, that just like what it speaks inspirationally to the soul, so that then if you want to see spirit and truth together, I mean, John's the gospel to look for with that. But to bring it back to this. Questions? Make sense? Comments? Confusion?
Well, it helped me just knowing it makes more sense of the Book of John. You know, that's how he's doing that.
Yeah. And one of the things John does is he gives us a lot of personal conversations Jesus has with people. Nicodemus, the woman at the well, his arguments with the Pharisees even in chapter 8. With the disciples, like personally, like of that ongoing conversation, 13, 14, 15, 16. If that's it on that, we will jump into more info. Are we good? You all right, Bonnie?
Yep.
Okay. You guys okay? Okay. All right, so last week we talked about... I think this will work. We talked about opportunities or pathways for evangelism. Was there anything, if you've even thought about it since last Tuesday, that you want to bring up before we jump into obstacles to evangelism that the early Christians faced? Because here, and I'll say it again. I said it last week, I'll say it again. We started on Sunday mornings a year and a half ago on deliverance. And since we started that course on that segment or section of classes on deliverance, we've done deliverance, ungodly beliefs, we've done inner healing, we've done physical healing, we've done, what else?
Right?
We did one on prophecy and healing. What else?
Praying for kids.
We did the one for kids.
Revelation. Was that one of them?
That was a Sunday school class.
Okay.
Yeah. All that to say, when you're engaged in evangelism, you usually want to be sensitive to the Holy Spirit to know what to do. So, and that's why I bring this story tonight with the woman at the well, because just in that passage, how many things could he have brought up? Right? He could have engaged on so many levels, but when we are out talking to people and we're sharing the faith with somebody, we've got to be able to discern. It's like you're going through the Rolodex. Do I talk to them about the thing they just said that's not correct, and they're probably living out of that ungodly belief, and that's hindering their spiritual life? Or do I address the fact that they just told me that their friend or their parent, their cousin has some terrible disease that we will pray for their physical healing? Like, you've got to be able to work through that on the spot. And sometimes the Holy Spirit's not going to tell you exactly what to zero in on. You've got to trust that your steps are being superintended by the Lord and go that way. And you've got to know how direct you're going to be. Most of the people I've shared the gospel with, when I hear later, what I typically hear later is they did come to the Lord. Like most of the people that I've led to the Lord, I don't typically ever meet again. Like it's just out doing evangelism, so I don't meet them. Right? And then I've done so much just like sharing the gospel and talking to people who've never heard the gospel that I eventually hear years later that they did. So I came to the Lord when I was 14, about 14 years old. And within a week, a couple of my buddies were pretty upset that I'd come to the Lord because I had a pretty significant life change, right? That's how you know you got saved. And one of them, let me abbreviate the story. I went away to Bible college and I came back, and one of them had started serving the Lord while I was gone. He was going to the youth group over there at Trinity, and he's a missionary. But when I came to the Lord, he was like, hey man, you got to chill. Stop talking to me about this. I said, no. If you're going to talk to me, this is what we're going to talk about. Well, that's rude. He's a missionary. And he's, we're friends. You talk to your friends a certain way that you, right? Another guy I was in high school with was from another country, just, had been here not long, and never heard the gospel. So I talked to him and his sister about the Lord, and I found out a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, Aiden's best friend at school, at the Catholic school, he's a Christian, and his parents are Christians. His father is the kid I knew in high school. And so I say that because I never thought I'd see any of these people. I mean, I'd see it, but some of the other stories like that. So don't think, because there's another thing in evangelism. Well, you've got to make a decision right then. No, you don't. You're throwing out seed and you're watering and you're pulling weeds. The Lord knows when to pull them in, and if we can stay tuned to the Spirit, we're going to know when to say. Because I've had twice in my whole life, people say to me, "Well, literally, what must I do to be saved?" Let me tell you. So, but that's rare. And that's with having led evangelism teams and street preaching and all that stuff, okay? You just stay in step and let the Lord use you the way He's going to use you, because those people may go on to do stuff that has nothing to do with you, but a whole lot to do with the kingdom. Okay, so let's talk about obstacles to evangelism. And I have notes. I'm going to try. Let's talk about first Jewish obstacles. Okay. The first stumbling block is this right here. Non-literal fulfillment of the prophecies. Jesus is not killing the Romans with a sword. He is reinterpreting how the prophecies are to be fulfilled, and they don't like it. And so this is an ongoing problem all the way through the book of Acts. Why do they hate Stephen so much? Because he speaks against the temple. Why do they arrest Paul at the end of Acts when he's in Jerusalem? He speaks against the temple and has brought a Gentile into the holy place. This is important right here, because you have a lot of people today who get into prophecy. I don't mean like personal prophecy. I mean like end time stuff. And they're so literal with what they think is the fulfillment that if they were to go back into the book of Acts, they side with the Jews in the stoning of Stephen rather than Stephen. They press for such a literal interpretation and fulfillment of things. That's a different issue. But this is one of the obstacles. This is the big one. In 70 AD, and this is really connected here. In 70 AD, the Christians do not take up arms against the Romans. The fall of Jerusalem. What does the Lord say in Matthew's Gospel when you see the city surrounded by armies? Flee. Guess what they did? They fled to Pella in the mountains. And as far as we know of all written record, not a single Christian died when Jerusalem fell to the armies of Titus and Vespasian. They listened and they left. But how did Israel, the Israelites, the Jews, respond to this? They expelled them from the synagogues. They kicked them out. Not just there in Israel, but wherever they were. They started kicking them out. And that takes us directly into the next issue. Because that's really the thing with the Jews. That's the biggest one. And next we'll Roman and Greek obstacles.
I'm sorry, what about like Jewish, the fact that Christians have killed Jews in the midst of their crusades and have persecuted
This
them?
is in the first couple centuries.
Okay.
That's where yeah, no, this is our time frame is the first before Christianity is legalized by the empire. Because that era, there are similarities to our own. And we're going to see that with this next one here. What were the problems, the obstacles that the Christians had in evangelizing the Romans and the Greeks?
They believed in multiple gods.
Polytheism. The Romans are polytheists, but they made a distinction between what we'll call like religion, religio, versus superstitio, I think I'm saying, superstitions. And really what this is, religion is the state. It's state sanctioned. This is private belief. That's why we get the word superstition from it. It's underground, it's secret. Okay? Judaism was licit, but according to Roman law. It was a illicit religion. You didn't have to worship the emperor to be Jewish. The Romans gave them a pass. When Rome would go in and conquer a people, guess what they would do to the gods those people worshipped? They worshipped them. They added those gods to their gods. When Rome went and conquered Israel, and Rome tried to say that the Lord was the same as Jupiter, how did the Jews respond? Because they absolutely refused and were always picking up a sword and fighting back. Rome said, okay, all right. You don't have to worship the Caesar, but you are going to pay taxes and listen to the law. So they gave them a protected class. So as long, pre-70 AD, as long as the Christians, in the eyes of Rome, were part of Judaism, they were legal. But when the Jews started kicking them out of the synagogue and saying, you can't do that here, that touches a little bit, Lucille, not to say that they were right, on why when Christianity becomes legal, they start saying no to synagogues. It's almost like a vengeance kind of thing. Does that make sense? Okay. You want to take it? So Christianity is considered one of these that's forbidden. And Rome had a couple others. You want to guess it? Another one that was forbidden? Druids. Black magic. I mean, it was against. I had a missionary friend in Mexico tell me 20-some years ago that if she went and prayed for somebody and the person got worse, she could be sued in court for practicing witchcraft.
Where was this?
Mexico. What part of Mexico she was ministering in? We chalk all of that stuff in America up to hocus pocus. Whatever, it's not real. No, it's real. So the Druids and a couple others, they couldn't do it. Another reason that Christians got lumped together with this is because who did they blame the fire in Rome on? Nero said the Christians burned Rome. The Druids were known for taking up arms against the Romans in Gaul and other places. So here it is that the Roman Senate and other leaders are being told the Christians are burning Rome. This is another reason they persecuted. They said that the rumor was that Christians were cannibals, incestuous, and atheists. They met in secret, they fed on Jesus' flesh and blood, and they called each other brother and sister. Now that sounds like, oh, that's so stupid, man. There's no way the church was like that. What's going on in Corinth? Sin that is a shame even to the world, Paul says. So were they doing it? Some places they were. In that sense, the obstacle is the church itself there in Corinth. Also, the Christians did not participate in the gladiator games. They didn't go to the theaters. They didn't enlist in the army. And they couldn't serve as teachers because if they were going to teach, they were going to teach the people to obey. They didn't join the military, some because they wouldn't kill, and others because all the military was dedicated to particular gods. To become a Christian in the early church was to sign up for martyrdom. It was to sign up for persecution. It was knowing that you're probably going to lose your trade guild unless you can secretly get into the meeting without bowing down to the statues. It was to forfeit your right to all kinds of stuff. There was a heavy cost to convert. And everything was a secret. When Jesus says, don't cast your before, guess what the Christians would not tell people? What they truly believed. Remember, you don't have a personal copy of the Bible, and your church probably doesn't yet. You've got some stuff from the Old Testament. You might have a copy of the Septuagint. You've probably got most of Paul's letter and a couple of the Gospels, but you don't have the whole thing yet. Right? And if you do have the whole thing yet, you can't read it. You've got a reader or two designated to read to the church on Sunday, and that you're doing at nighttime, or you're doing it before the sun rises amongst the gravestones. Very different. So the core was the Apostles' Creed. So if somebody said they wanted to become a Christian, they would submit them to a year and a half of teaching. And they wouldn't tell them the Apostles' Creed until a week before they were baptized. They would not tell them what it meant. You want to learn what this is? There's an ethic that you have to abide by to be baptized to participate in the community. Very different, very different. As opposed to today, let's put up the billboards and get on the radio, reduce all the requirements and standards because there's only grace and there's only love and there's only mercy. And Andy, it's enough. It's a song. Very different. So you can see that if conversion means it's going to be tough. Now it's not like that everywhere across the empire, because it was very localized kinds of persecutions. But those are very specific obstacles that they had. Questions or comments?
Do you think the signs that we read about in the book of Acts were with all of them, like the common folks as Christianity kind of spread out, and like those signs persisted, that people were healed, people were raised from the dead, and food was multiplied, and just did they? So they lived in the miraculous for how long?
They didn't all live in the same thing. Irenaeus is writing about 180, and he talks about the gifts of the Spirit still being present. But they were never... It's hard to have a parallel today to what the descriptions are like for them. We have the written liturgies, which is what our prayer book's based on. But they have the gifts of the Spirit, but they don't have the dichotomy that we have.
What does that mean?
Opposition, the opposing ideas. Like, you didn't have Christians who said we don't need that stuff, and that's not true. That wasn't there. And you didn't, and so conversely, you didn't have Christians saying, well, we need to have this because this is proof that we're really filled with the Spirit. That didn't exist either. They just were. They just had these things. And the gifts varied according to the needs that they had. So it was, and because they believed God superintended the world, they didn't think he was far away. So when they go to pray, and we read about their prayer meetings, they do have long prayer, like long nights of prayer, but you never really have the sense that you ever been to prayer meetings and you can, like, people are praying and they think, they're talking to God, but as you're praying and you're just kind of in the room, right? Especially one where there's not like a whole lot of organization. And the people are praying, and all of a sudden you become aware that they're talking more because they want other people to know what they're saying than they are interested in God knowing what they're saying. So they go on all these rabbit trails where the details, and it's 15 minutes into their prayer, and you're like, man, the Lord heard this before you even said it. And this is why Jesus says what he does. Don't think you heard because you have many words. I was in a prayer meeting one time. The guy was a veterinarian, and so somebody had a horse that was sick. So did we have somebody standing for the horse? I think we did. And so he starts praying. Everybody's laying hands on this person, and starts praying for. He gets super technical, and I'm like, that's really cool. I don't have any clue what he was talking about, but I figure he knows and the Lord knows. But after it goes on and on for a while, like you're kind of missing the point of corporate prayer here.
Right.
When we read about the way they were operating in the early church, I mean, it was not. It's just different.
So, like on the day of Pentecost, where they're prophesying and they're proclaiming
Yeah.
the goodness of God, and so, that is something that I'm compelled to believe. Like that's what the Spirit is stirring up when people come together corporately. He's stirring up that just gushing forth of praise and worship, and and it's not stifled. It's it's everything you've got, every cell of your body proclaiming your
I think
love
that's
for God. You think that's because it sounds like, and we imagine that's what it was like in the first church.
In Pentecost, they're preaching in languages they don't know because of the different nations that are there. The Spirit does bubble up on the inside. He does gush out. We do like raise our voices to pray. I mean, all of that. But much of that is personality. It's personality specific.
Yeah.
So there's lots of people that when the Spirit moves upon them, they're silent.
Right.
Yeah. So, and in the early church, Corinth being the exception, you can't have loud prayer meetings in the catacombs before the sun rises. So the whole approach is if we want to survive, and we don't get the sense that they're upset about that. I mean, the persecution, obviously, but you just don't get that kind of vibe, I guess, when you read the writings.
And they're probably not doing that in China today either.
Right. I mean, I'm sure that, if they know that they can be loud, they are, but that's not, the Spirit isn't measured with volume.
Right.
So,
but the Jew, now all of this, to me, like the Psalms are sort of the standard for praise and worship and singing and music and all of that, and you imagine, and just knowing even modern Jewish culture, I mean, it's exuberant.
oh yeah, so celebratory, I mean, that's ancient culture. The ancient Rome and Greeks, they knew about prophetesses. They had prophetesses and prophets and the slaying of animals and the shedding of blood and the dancing and the timbling. I mean, that was everywhere. That was even in ancient Israel. What differentiates the prophets of Baal and Elijah on Carmel? Elijah is not jumping up and down. He's not cutting himself. He's not doing anything like that. He builds an altar. He has them drench that thing, and then he kneels down and he prays. That's it. And there's something in that, because the danger is when we interpret expression by our own personality, that's when we judge what's alive and what's dead, and we can't do that. I can tell you as a preacher, you can't do that. Because I'll be preaching a sermon or giving a teaching or something, and I'm thinking, man, anybody care about this? But then within 72 hours, I've got so many phone calls and emails and texts, hey, thank you, la da da, and it's as opposed to those times when you're like, man, the anointing was really there. Well, it clearly wasn't, because nobody got changed. They may have been loud, but they didn't get changed. And there's a difference. So, I don't know if that answers kind of what you're talking about. But
It's just, so I'm visual, so I'm trying to picture things that you're talking about. And then just, I just came back from a conference with 4,000 people.
right.
Where the dancing and twirling and guys leaping and then you've got people just sitting quietly for hours and hours. And, you know, just looking at the diversity of the way people respond, you know, in a time of corporate worship, especially when it's hundreds of people.
Yeah. That was
It was cool.
Respond to personalities after that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't.
Yeah.
What did Eric say? Eric, what'd you say?
I think would kind of fall under the personality of an individual.
I was at a Pentecost Power and Prophecy Conference back in '06 in Missouri. And, man, they were dancing, flag waving, jumping,
Got a lot of that going on.
yelling till the voice is gone, the whole thing. And then drove up to another, to the IHOP, to a big prayer meeting. And it was a service they were having. Went in there, entirely different. All the music was subdued. It was all quiet. And I'm still like, that stuff is so, like, there's almost veins within the temperament created that reflects the personality of the people that are leading it. And then you get called into one of those, and the longer you stay in one of those and don't look externally, the more you judge everything else by the particular grace and expression of that.
Right.
And that's the danger of
Right, and yeah, I think that's important to recognize because in our culture, in Christian circles, people will judge something based on, you know, how exuberant, how loud, and if it's not loud and exuberant, well, it wasn't very anointed. You know, they just come to those conclusions.
I like things that are exuberant, don't get me wrong.
Right.
When you're looking at the early church, as I mentioned last week, the conversion of the empire happens because their children stay in the faith. And then they're rescuing children, raising them as their own, and keeping them, and they're staying in the faith. We're looking for silver bullets on how to reconvert America. And really, the biggest lesson we can take from these people, whether it's with their obstacles and then with the pathways that they had, their families maintained obedience to the Lord. And that whole notion is foreign in America. It's foreign. Y'all know Mike's got 9 kids. We were talking about that last week. He said, Darryl, man, nobody believes that. I said, I know. He said, I'm trying to raise mine all to serve. I know. But when you look at what is it about the way that the early Christians operated in the spirit and their Christian life, and I say in spirit Christian life, those aren't separate things. They're not separate things. My hope is that as we keep going over the next couple of weeks, we can really kind of dive into what we see Jesus and the early Christians doing. They're just in the Gospels, and then reflecting a little bit on, you know, a couple centuries on out, and how they did that. And we'll do that. But for tonight, we'll wrap up, take a couple minute break, and we can come back and we'll pray. All right.